Now, we've just finished listening to General Keith Alexander's insights about the challenges of using various cyber tools to defend our national security. And the general, I think, was pretty clear that we need to think about problems and come up with potential solutions. And those solutions, in his opinion, should be some balance between security and privacy. And perhaps we have to look at how that affects our individual freedoms. Now, our luncheon speaker today is going to differ, not surprisingly, with the general on several key points. Dr. Chris Soghoian is the principal technologist with the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, and is also a visiting fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. Mr. Soghoian is ranked number 46 on Politico's Top 50 Influencers Guide to the Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming American Politics in 2015 for Watching the Online Watchers. He has spoken on this topic in a number of public forums and academic panels across this country. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Soghoian.
Is this on? Yeah? Okay. Can you guys hear me in the back, in the cheap seats? Yeah? Cool. So thank you all for having me here. I don't usually get to speak to military audiences or future military audiences, and so this is a really, really fun experience for me. So I'm a surveillance expert. I've been studying surveillance for more than 10 years now. And my Ph.D. was focused on studying the role that technology companies play in helping the government spy on their customers, which turned out to be a pretty topical thing to study. So I want to tell you, I guess, a couple history lessons today, tell you some stories about how the government has coped with changes in technology, and in some ways, the unintended consequences of allowing law enforcement and the intelligence community to access our private communications. All right, so for more than 100 years, the telephone companies have willingly facilitated government surveillance. The first wiretaps in the United States were in the late 1890s in New York. But for 100 years, the phone companies have been a happy partner with the government. After 9/11, for example, Verizon, one of the biggest phone companies in the country, actually argued in court that they had a First Amendment right to share their customers' information with the National Security Agency. And so this relationship is a really tight one. The phone companies see themselves as being on the same side of the issue as the government. And not only is this a happy partnership, but in fact, the phone companies designed their products with surveillance in mind. As consumers moved from the telegraph to the telephone, from the wireline phone to the cell phone, from calls to text messages to internet access on our smartphones, along that way, every new product that the companies started to offer was built with surveillance in mind as a feature. So let that sort of sink in for a second. The phones that we use in our pockets were designed with surveillance as a primary feature. Now, of course, 100 years ago, it would be an operator who would be connecting your calls, and if the government wanted to spy on your calls, they'd have to enlist someone to connect some wires to enable that surveillance. Of course, that's not possible anymore. There's just too many telephone calls. And so today, there are centrally managed surveillance systems. From a single office, an employee at one of the phone companies can turn on a wiretap and allow the authorities to listen to your calls. And to be clear, I'm just talking about the technology here. There are legal procedures that have to be followed, court orders have to be obtained, that kind of thing. But there's been a really big shift over the last 10 years or so, which is causing political waves through Washington. It's leading to fights in the courts and ultimately large disputes on the front pages of newspapers. And that's that consumers are moving from communications provided by the phone companies who were friends with the government to moving their communications to the tech companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples of the world, who in some cases are less inclined to go along with that surveillance, who are less happy to provide voluntary spying assistance for the government. And this is leading to some confrontation. So I'm sure all of you have heard of this fight between the FBI and Apple, and I know that the General discussed it in his remarks earlier. You know, Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, he's been sort of the public face of this fight, but the technologies that Apple put in place have actually, the technologies that the FBI are now complaining about have actually been in place for several years. And this fight has sort of been slowly brewing for a while. All right, so what are the things that Apple has done? I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So there are a few technologies that Apple has deployed. The first is that they are encrypting data stored on the phone using a technology that essentially means that Apple has no easy way of helping law enforcement get data off the phone. So they're encrypting information that's stored on the phone. They're also encrypting iMessage, which is the text messaging app built into the iPhone. So if you have an iPhone and your friend has an iPhone and you send text messages back and forth, without you doing anything special, those messages are encrypted in such a way that even Apple cannot see them. Similarly, FaceTime, which is Apple's video and voice conferencing system, that is also encrypted with a strong degree of security that makes it very, very difficult for Apple to provide any kind of surveillance assistance for the government. So, you know, as this debate has unfolded in the news over the past weeks and months, government officials have criticized Apple and said that the company is putting profit before national security, that the company is prioritizing the privacy interests of terrorists, that it's merely trying to cater to European customers and Chinese customers who don't want an FBI friendly smartphone. But I think it's actually important to understand that many of the security technologies that are in the iPhone predated Snowden's arrival in the public sphere. The encryption that is built into the phone that is most frustrating law enforcement has been there since at least 2012, maybe even before that. So why did Apple decide to encrypt their phones? If they did it before Snowden, it wasn't motivated by fears that German consumers would abandon the device. It wasn't because the Chinese were upset about NSA surveillance. Why would Apple build a device that would be so secure that it would frustrate most law enforcement access? It's important to understand a few other things that have been happening in our country over the last few years. In the summer of 2014, there was a huge scandal when the smartphone backup accounts of a number of Hollywood starlets were hacked. So I don't know how many of you remember this episode. Very, very famous starlets, Kate Upton and some other folks had their accounts hacked. So when this thing first happened, the criticism from public commentators was, these women, and it was mainly women, these women, should have known better. If you're going to take photographs of yourself that are compromising and send them over the internet, you're going to get what's coming to you, which was really just, I think, disgraceful, a really inappropriate response. But many of these women never sent their images over the internet. What had happened is they had taken photographs of themselves with their smartphones, and then their phones had upgraded. Apple had rolled out a new version of its operating system, and Apple suddenly started backing up photographs automatically. So these individuals thought that these photos would just stay on their phones. Apple rolls out this new feature to be helpful because people lose their phones, they drop them in the toilet, the dog smashes your phone or whatever. People don't want to lose most of their photographs, and so Apple helpfully decided to automatically back up the photos. The problem with this was that when people set up their Apple accounts, their Apple user IDs and passwords, most people thought that these accounts were only protecting their credit card information for the Apple Store, right? You don't want someone to buy an app with your credit card. So if you're a millionaire Hollywood celebrity, you probably have better things to worry about than someone, buying the new levels for Angry Birds with your credit card. And so many of these women didn't have particularly strong passwords. And so the hackers who broke into their accounts were actually able to either spoof Apple and convince them to enter in their password in a malicious website, or they're actually able to guess their password through repeated attempts. But I want to be clear about this incident, that these women, they hadn't been sending their photographs over the internet. And I think this episode was a real wake-up call for the executives at Apple who realized, oh wait, people are storing more than just photos of their dogs and children on their phones. People are storing extremely sensitive private information on their devices. And so I think this episode was a really big wake-up call for the company. Secondly, as consumers embrace smartphones in large numbers, suddenly we were all sort of walking around the street with these really expensive computers in our pockets and in our hands. And so you'd be standing on the subway platform in New York talking on your phone, and if someone ran by and grabbed your phone and then ran on, they just stole something worth $500, $600 that they could easily sell on the black market. And so there was a huge wave of smartphone theft that was taking place in large cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And some of this theft was really violent. People would be held up at gunpoint or at knife point. People would be getting hurt if they were resisting the thieves. And so as a result of that wave of crime, we actually had a concerted effort by politicians, particularly police chiefs of big cities, calling on the tech companies to build anti-theft features into their phones. Now, one of the anti-theft features that Apple and Google ultimately built into their phones was an encryption feature and a wipe feature that would protect data when the phone was stolen. The idea was if the phone stopped working after it had been stolen, it would disincentivize future thieves from stealing phones. But the technology that is now at the center of this Apple dispute, in fact, was rolled out by the phone companies in order to provide consumers with the easy ability to remotely wipe their phones after they were stolen. This is a photo from one of the press conferences where the New York Attorney General was actually demanding that Apple and Google take action to protect their phones. Now, these actions actually worked. After Apple and Google rolled out increased security in their smartphones, violent phone theft went down. Double-digit numbers in major cities around the world. So this was actually a pretty good, successful policy initiative. You had politicians calling for more secure phones, which led to a significant reduction in violent crime and the theft of data in smartphones. But the consequence of this was that then the phones were made to be more secure. So Apple has secured its devices. They've obviously been in the headlines, but they're not the only company that has built strong security into its product. This is the CEO and founder of WhatsApp. Anyone in the room use WhatsApp? Show of hands. Okay, so WhatsApp is probably the most popular mobile messaging service in the world. It has 1 billion users. Most of them are not in the United States, but it is extremely popular. And so as of November of 2014, WhatsApp now encrypts its text messages with the same level of security as Apple uses for iMessage, perhaps even more secure. This is Jan Koum, the CEO that I showed a few seconds ago. Quote, "Nobody should have the right to eavesdrop or you become a totalitarian state. The kind of state I escaped as a kid to come to this country where you have democracy and freedom of speech. Our goal is to protect it." So Jan grew up in one of the Iron Curtain countries. He grew up under a system of authoritarian rule where the state could learn everything you were saying. And so when he built this popular messaging platform, he wanted to make sure it was as secure as possible. So WhatsApp has now delivered this. 1 billion people spread around the world now have the means to communicate securely in a way that makes it very, very difficult for governments to intercept their text messages and soon their voice calls. Okay, so one other interesting aspect of this debate. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has probably done more than any person in the country to spread strong surveillance-proof encryption technology throughout the world. One of her big initiatives when she arrived at the State Department was to push money into something called Internet Freedom Technology. So if you think back a few years, the Arab Spring is happening, people are protesting in the streets of Egypt, of Tunisia, other countries. The governments there are freaking out. You have these dictatorships that are on the verge of crumbling. And what do these governments do in order to try and keep their citizens under control? Well, the first thing that they do is cut the internet, right? They try and stop the free flow of information. Then what they do is they roll out aggressive internet filtering to make sure that news from outside of the country cannot get in. And so one of Secretary Clinton's main policy initiatives was to inject money into the creation, or to inspire and fund the creation of technologies that will allow people to circumvent the filters that many of these authoritarian countries were imposing on their people, and actually to fund the development of technologies that allow people to communicate securely, so that dissidents in Iran and China could communicate about their democratic activities without fear of being arrested or beaten or killed by the authorities. Sorry, this chopped off at the end. So this is Secretary of State Clinton from February 2011. The United States continues to help people in oppressive internet environments get around filters and stay one step ahead of the censors, the hackers and the thugs who beat them up or imprison them for what they say online. So, I mean, this is, 5 years ago, but for several years, this was a key pillar of US foreign policy, the idea that we can spread democracy around the world by spreading tools that allow people to communicate in secure ways, in ways that cannot be surveilled easily. So one of the technologies that the US government funded is an app called Signal, which is a secure communications app. We use it at my office to communicate internally. That same technology was adopted by WhatsApp. So it received about $2 million of US government funding. And so the technology that now allows 1 billion people around the world to communicate securely, that stops the government of Iran, government of Syria, government of China from being able to spy on their citizens' communications, that was funded by the taxpayer. And personally, I feel like for a $2 million investment, getting 1 billion people to be able to communicate securely and protect themselves from authoritarian governments, that's a pretty good return on investment for the US taxpayer. All right, so you have Apple responding to concerns from customers about data security, about theft of private data, politicians saying that they need to secure smartphones to protect them against theft. You have WhatsApp rolling out encryption, in part motivated by the upbringing of the founder of the company, and the technology being funded by the US government. And the end result is that now many people have a device in their pockets that they can use to communicate securely, right? And so going back to the beginning of my talk, for really most of the last 100 years, if you made a telephone call and law enforcement took an interest in you, they believed that you were a bad person, they could listen to your calls once they got the right kind of court order. As people migrated from telephone calls to text messages, if they believed that you were saying something improper, or they believed that you were engaging in some kind of criminal activity, the government could get your text messages, not just going forward into the future, but they could find your text messages from last week, or the week before, or the month before. If they wanted to know who you were hanging out with and who you were conspiring with, they could get your location information from the phone companies and learn everywhere you've gone over the last months or years in some cases. Right? And so all of our lives were cataloged because the phone companies were collecting all this information, and it was there to be shared with law enforcement when law enforcement obtained the right kind of legal process. And then in the last 5 years, everything changes. Suddenly, if you have an iPhone in your pocket, you can make telephone calls that the government cannot listen to anymore, no matter what kind of court order. If you have an iPhone in your pocket and you're sending text messages through iMessage, or you're making video and voice chats through FaceTime, or if you're one of the 1 billion people in the world who's downloaded WhatsApp onto your smartphone, suddenly you can communicate with a degree of security that until recent years was only really available to governments. right? And as that shift has occurred, we went from a world where all of our communications were just sort of sitting there, waiting to be obtained by the government, or waiting to be stolen by hackers, to a world where most of our communications, or an increasingly large percentage of our communications, are now secure from all threats. So this isn't going over very well in Washington. This is the FBI Director, Jim Comey. He has, for several years now, been criticizing the tech companies. He says that it's inappropriate for them to build devices that are so secure that it keeps law enforcement out. He says the companies have designed warrant-proof encryption technology that frustrates even court-authorized surveillance. And he's right. Now, we can quibble about what the motivation was, whether Apple designed the encryption in its phones to thwart the FBI, or to thwart the Chinese, or to thwart identity thieves, or to reduce violent phone theft. But the end result is that it is much more difficult now for law enforcement to be able to watch the bad guy. That even people on the civil liberties side will not argue, at least many of them, and myself included, will not argue that, that life has not gotten more difficult for law enforcement. It is, in fact, far more difficult now for law enforcement to spy on telephone calls and text messages than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Director Comey says that the FBI needs a method of access. When critics have said that his proposal is for a back door in our cell phones, he said, no, we don't want a back door. We want a front door. We want a front door that everyone knows about, no secret keys hidden around. We just want a well-defined mechanism that we can use when authorized by the court to go in and get what we need. This is, of course, the current NSA director, Mike Rogers. He's built on Director Comey's comments and said, I don't want a back door, I want a front door. And I want that front door to have multiple locks, really big locks. Okay, so we have government officials saying that they want some kind of method of access. The tech community are sort of all aligned on the other side saying, no, we don't want to build anything into the phones that weakens their security or provides access to law enforcement. So what's wrong with the law enforcement proposals? The term that engineers use to describe what the government wants is called key escrow. Essentially what that means is instead of only one key existing, the key being used by the user to protect the data, there'd be a second copy of the key, and it would be held by the tech company. So instead of just me having a key that locks my phone, Google would have a copy of it, and they'd store it in a secure, safe place. And if I did something bad, and the authorities got a court order, they would go to Google and they'd say, please give us the key that unlocks Chris's information. So the problem with this from an engineering standpoint is that having that second key around creates risk. So the best example of this comes from the world of smartphones and SIM cards. I don't know, how many people in the room know what a SIM card is? Oh, good. Okay, cool. In the US, you get your SIM card included in the phone, so many people have never touched them. So the biggest manufacturer of SIM cards in the world is a company called Gemalto. They're a French-Dutch company, and SIM cards are used first to prove who you are to the phone company. That's how you can connect to the phone network. Your telephone number is sort of stored in there. That's how you can, when you take your SIM card out and put it in a new phone, that's how your number moves with you. And the SIM cards actually store an encryption key that protects the communications between your phone and the cell tower. And there's supposed to only be 2 copies of the key. One on your phone in the SIM, and another held by the phone company. And only those are supposed to be the only 2 copies that exist. But it turned out that there was a third copy of these keys. They were held by the company that made the SIM cards. And the reason was, you're manufacturing these SIM cards in bulk. You sell 1 million of them at a time to Verizon or AT&T. You deliver the SIM cards and you deliver a DVD with all the keys on it to the phone company. What if the DVD gets lost in the mail? Well, suddenly these keys, these SIM cards are useless. And so the manufacturer of of the biggest manufacturer in the world of SIM cards, this company Gemalto, they kept a backup copy of their customers' telephone encryption keys. And we learned last year that the British intelligence agency GCHQ actually hacked into Gemalto's computers, spied on its engineers, and then stole all those keys so they could listen to telephone calls in other countries where Gemalto chips were used. So Gemalto sells SIM cards to AT&T and to T-Mobile in the United States. Any of you who eventually go and work for the government or the military, you'll probably get, I think they call them, is it a PIV card in the military? Yeah? So the PIV card that the military uses as their ID cards that you use to log into your computers at work, those have chips made by Gemalto. And so the company that makes the chips for the military's ID cards, the company that manufactures our smart passports in the United States, this is the same company. They were hacked by our ally in the United Kingdom. So this is from an article published by The Intercept, sourced with Snowden documents. GCHQ clandestinely cyber-stalked Gemalto employees, scouring their emails in an effort to find people who may have had access to the company's networks and encryption key generating systems. GCHQ operatives identified key individuals and their positions within Gemalto and then dug into their emails. So to be clear, Gemalto was never accused of being some kind of terrorist organization. They weren't, stealing intellectual property from the United States or from the UK. They were a legitimate business that made technology that everyone in the world is using, and they had something of value, which were these copies of these encryption keys. And if you stole those keys, suddenly you could listen to telephone calls anywhere in the world. And so what the Gemalto episode shows is that if the keys are sitting somewhere, it's going to be really, really attractive for someone else to try and steal them. Now, maybe we argue, maybe we say, Google and Apple are really good at security. We're sure they can protect the keys. Well, but you would have thought that about Gemalto. Another example, there's a company called RSA, which makes these little tokens. I don't know if has anyone ever had one of these tokens in their keychain before? So these are the things that you use to log into secure networks. The government uses them. And this company, RSA, a tech company based in Massachusetts and Boston, they also kept a copy of the keys that were baked into them. No one knew they'd kept a copy. Everyone thought it was only the customer that had the one copy of the key. China broke into RSA's computer systems, stole the keys, and then was able to impersonate people who had these devices and broke into the networks of several US defense contractors. Right, so if there is a key somewhere, there's a good chance someone's going to try and steal it. All right, well, then, we've heard Director Comey say, there are plenty of tech companies that give us access to their customers' information. Google and Yahoo hand over emails every day. No one's saying that Google isn't secure, right? Well, it turns out that even the big tech companies like Google have been targeted by nation states, by sophisticated nation states. And the things that nation states go for more than anything else, the thing they really want is to attack the surveillance systems that companies have designed and deployed. So if you have an official surveillance mechanism built into your product through which emails, telephone calls, other sensitive data has to go through to be spied on under appropriate circumstances, that system is going to be a really attractive target for hackers and foreign governments too. So in 2009, China hacked into Google systems, and we only learned a couple years ago that the system that was hacked at Google was Google's surveillance team. The Chinese wanted to know which Chinese agents were under surveillance by the US government. They obviously couldn't call up the Department of Justice and ask that, and so they just broke into Google systems to get that information for themselves. Microsoft also got hacked by China in that 2009 incident, and then got hacked again a couple years later by the Syrian Electronic Army. And so if a company like Google or a company like Microsoft that has hundreds of people, hundreds of cybersecurity experts, if they cannot protect their data, if they cannot protect their surveillance team, who are supposed to be keeping things under lockdown, what hope is there for any company? All right, so if you have a copy of the key, it might get stolen. if you build a surveillance interface into your product, someone's going to try and hack it. Well, what if you buy an off-the-shelf surveillance system? What if you buy an off-the-shelf surveillance system that's supposed to provide lawful access? How do you even know that that off-the-shelf system is secure? There are two great stories about this. In 2004, the Greeks held the Olympic Games. It was a really big event. This was the first Olympic Games after 9/11, so there was a lot of concern about security. So the Greeks invited the US government to come help them out and provide security. The NSA was invited in to partner with the Greeks, and the Greeks even provided the NSA with access to their national telephone switch to be able to listen they provided them access to their national telephone surveillance infrastructure to be able to target the calls of suspected bad guys who were going to be threatening the games. The games went by without any problems, and the Greeks thought that then the NSA would leave. They would stop using that interface. Turns out that without the knowledge of the Greeks, someone, an unknown entity, broke into the networking equipment and reactivated some of the features that had been turned off, and then used that mechanism to spy on the Greek prime minister and members of his cabinet. That is, the Greeks paid for a surveillance mechanism, they paid for a national wiretapping infrastructure, and then had it used against them without their knowledge or consent by an entity largely believed to be the NSA. And then what is perhaps my favorite example of a surveillance backdoor gone bad. The government of Bahamas was approached by the Drug Enforcement Administration and offered a gift. The gift was a free wiretapping system for the country. Bahamas is a major staging point for drug dealers, international drug dealers, stopping their speedboats on their way to Miami. They have a big problem with money laundering and drug-related crime, and they don't have a lot of resources. They're a relatively poor country. And so the DEA said, we're going to give you this entire wiretapping system. That way, whenever you have a suspected criminal, you can press a button and listen to their telephone calls, and we'll work together. We'll share intelligence with you and help you find bad guys. So this was actually this was a Trojan horse. It's a great story. It turns out there was a secret backdoor built into the wiretapping system that allowed the NSA to listen to every telephone call in the country, not one by one, but actually record every telephone call and send them back to the US. So you'd think, well, why is the Bahamas, why are they having all of their calls spied on? Most people in the Bahamas are not bad people. They're nice people living in a beautiful place. And it turns out that NSA wanted to use the Bahamas as a test bed. Like, if you can spy on this small country and listen to every telephone call there, we can work out the kinks in the system and then over time roll it out to bigger countries with more complicated communications infrastructure. So the Bahamas thought they were getting some free surveillance equipment. What they instead got was not a nation-level wiretap enabled by the NSA, or taking place by the NSA. So hopefully these sort of examples show you that there are significant risks when you bring surveillance infrastructure into your country, when you wire up your telephone system for surveillance, when you wire up your email system for surveillance. There are risks that you may not be able to control who has access. And at a time when we are so concerned about sophisticated foreign adversaries, the Chinese, the Russians, the Israelis, we should be really questioning whether it makes sense to wire up our own telephone systems, our own emails for surveillance going forward. And so that's why many people are arguing that what we really need right now is not less encryption, but more. Many people are arguing that instead of asking Apple to weaken its security, the FBI should be encouraging Apple and encouraging other companies to employ even more. So this is perhaps my favorite example of blowback when it comes to encryption and surveillance. This is what cell phones looked like in the late 80s and early 90s. If you had one of these, you were very rich. They were expensive. The batteries didn't last that long. And I guess in that way, things haven't changed too much. And so this guy is Newt Gingrich. This was a very famous Republican politician. The adults in the room will know who he was. I suspect the cadets probably will not. So there was a really interesting scandal back in the mid-1990s. So these old-fashioned cell phones, they didn't have any encryption at all, which meant that if you had one of these devices, like a radio scanner that you would use to listen to truckers driving on the highway, you could buy one of these things for $100 at Radio Shack or a store, and then you could listen to people's cell phone calls. There was absolutely no security in the early cell phone systems in this country. If you had an off-the-shelf device, you could listen to any call. So there was this scandal in the 90s where Newt Gingrich is on a conference call with John Boehner, who's now who was the head of the Republican Party, and the head of the Republicans in the House. So he's on the phone with these senior Republicans, and they're talking about stuff as politicians do. And a couple in Florida are tuning through the dial on their radio scanner, and they pick up this conference call involving like some of the most important Republicans in the country. And they did what I suspect many people would do. They put in a cassette tape and started recording it. Just kidding, nope, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. And then they provided that recording to a Democratic member of Congress, and who then launched an ethics probe into the topic of the conversation. So Congress cares about one thing more than anything else, and that's themselves. And so there were quickly hearings that were held into the security of America's telephone system. And so there's this great quote from the head of the Phone Industry Lobbying Association, 1997 at this hearing. And he's telling Congress, unless you do something, this problem's not going to go away. So he said, unless Congress takes a forward-looking approach, history will likely repeat itself as interception equipment, though expensive now, drops in price in the future. And the issue was those big analog phones, the brick ones, they were actually going away. We were going to get the small flip phones instead. And those were a little bit more secure, but the only reason they were secure was because the spy equipment was really expensive. It cost like $200,000 to buy a piece of equipment that would let you listen to those flip phones. And so the head of the phone industry, the head of the phone company lobbying group said, hey, Congress, this problem's not going to go away. You cannot ignore it. If you don't do something, we'll be right back here in 20 years. You need to ensure that the phone system is secured. So this is pure DC. That guy who was the top lobbyist for the phone industry, it's this guy. His name is Tom Wheeler. He's currently the chairman of the FCC. So he's now the guy in charge of regulating the phone industry. And unfortunately, in the 20 years since that hearing, Congress didn't do anything. And our phone calls were not secured. The telephone companies never deployed strong encryption. And as Mr. Wheeler predicted, the cost of the spy equipment dropped from $200,000 down and down and down and down and down. So there's been a lot of research and journalism in the last few years sort of describing what happened. Essentially, the phone industry was pressured to build very weak encryption into telephones so that nation states could spy on people who are using cell phones. The governments were really worried that if they couldn't be able to spy on phone calls, that criminals would be able to hide their activities. And so as a result, we now ended up with a situation where even leaders of major countries are no longer able to trust the security of their phone system. This is Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who it was revealed 2 years ago, the NSA had spied on her unencrypted telephone calls. So the place that the mechanism by which the US government spied on Angela Merkel's telephone calls was this thing. It's on the roof of the US Embassy in Berlin. It's called a spy nest. That's sort of the nickname for it. And essentially, our telephone calls are going through the air either with no encryption at all or with the weakest form of encryption that you can now break it with a laptop and some free software you download online. And so major intelligence agencies set up these spy stations on the roofs of embassies around the world, and then they listen to the telephone calls of people nearby. And we do it, and the Russians do it, and the Chinese do it. Everyone does it. It's just we got caught doing it. This is my favorite photo of a spy station. This is in Vienna, in Austria. These are 3 UN buildings, and then you can see the little chin hanging off that building over there. That gives the NSA like a perfect look down with their antennas, and so they're able to listen to the calls that are taking place down below. So the group at the NSA that does that spying is called the Special Collections Service. This is my favorite part of the NSA, and they are based at embassies around the world. There are 80 locations around the world through which dedicated NSA units spy on unencrypted or not very well encrypted telephone calls. So initially, the technology to do this spying was limited just to the military and the intelligence community. And I suspect that one day, many of the cadets in this room will be deployed to war zones where you will get to take advantage of the lack of security in the Afghan telephone system or the Somali telephone system, and you'll be able to use drone-mounted interception devices to identify phones below and listen to their calls. And the technology that the US government uses in those war zones has, over the last 10 years, come back home. It has trickled down to state and local law enforcement agencies who now are able to get for $40,000 or $50,000 a dedicated device that lets them track all the phones in a neighborhood or listen to people's phone calls if they acquire that capability. But that capability is not just limited to law enforcement. It turns out there are now dozens of companies in China and Russia and Pakistan and India who will sell you for a few $1,000s a device that will let you listen to other people's phone calls. And so what Chairman Wheeler said has happened. 20 years ago, there was an effective US government monopoly over spying technology that allowed people to listen to telephone calls. And today, you can go online, go to Alibaba, which is like the Chinese eBay, and for a few $1,000s, buy a device that lets you listen to the phone calls of your neighbors. The telephone system is not keeping you safe. And then this is actually a photo from DEF CON, the big hacker conference every year in Las Vegas, in which a researcher on stage is setting up some homemade spying equipment. For a few $100s, you can now build your own device if you're tech savvy. If you're a computer science student, you can download some free software online and plug it into your computer and build your own low-cost spying device that takes advantage of the lack of security in our telephone system. And so, as a country, we don't have a secure telephone system. As a country right now, anyone in this room, if you're making a regular telephone call on your cell phone, the only thing ensuring, or the only thing protecting your telephone calls is the fact that it's unlikely there's a criminal outside in the parking lot. But if you're someone interesting, if you're a CEO of a company, if you're a lawyer or a doctor or an investigative reporter or a human rights activist, if you're using a regular cell phone to make regular telephone calls, your calls are completely vulnerable to spying done by law enforcement, by foreign governments, by criminals, or amateur hackers who have built their own spying devices. And so that's why it's so important that we move to services like those provided by Apple and WhatsApp. That's why it's so important that we finally start encrypting our calls, because the phone companies who have, to their credit, been very helpful to the government have failed to deliver strong security. I think 100 years ago, maybe it made sense to have every telephone be wired for surveillance. But today, at a time when cybersecurity fears are huge, whether it's the OPM breach, which tens of millions of US government employees had their information stolen, whether it's the hacks at Anthem or the IRS, and I think there have been multiple breaches of the IRS in the last year, it's clear that we're living in a scary time where information is not being adequately protected. And so we should be doing everything we possibly can to protect ourselves. Yes, that means it's going to be tougher for law enforcement. Yes, that means the FBI might not be able to listen to calls that they could listen to in the past, or get text messages they could listen to in the past, or get data off of phones they could get in the past. But the alternative is to live in a world with no security, where everything is up for grabs, and it's not just being taken by the FBI, but can be accessed by criminals and foreign governments too. Thank you very much. So I guess I have some time for questions. Is there a mic somewhere, or how do you want to do this? All right, there's a roving mic. The one with the microphone will come to you, and then please end your question with a question mark.
Can you hear me, sir?
I can.
All right. So in December of 2015, China passed a new cybersecurity and counterterrorism bill that mandated that all technology coming into the country would provide law enforcement with a decryption key. Now, obviously, it's very popular. Apple has been squawking over the FBI, providing a decryption key for one phone. Why are they not squawking over China mandating that all phones and all technology have a decryption key? And, sir, do you see that as hypocritical?
So my understanding is that Apple has not yet built the mechanism that the Chinese government have asked for. I think they've been fighting that. I imagine that if whatever Apple ultimately gives the FBI, China is going to want to. Whatever the U.S. government, whatever Apple gives China, the Russians are going to want, and the Saudi Arabians are going to want, and the Germans are going to want, and the Brits are going to want. And so I think for Apple, one of the reasons why they're fighting so hard against the FBI right now is they realize the only way they can keep everyone else away is to have a consistent policy. But you cannot say, you know, okay, we're going to give you privileged access, but we're not going to give you privileged access, right? And so, like, what would a solution look like? Should a phone sold in the U.S. only have a backdoor for the FBI? Because the Germans are not going to want to buy a phone that the U.S. can access, and the U.S. we're not going to want the, you know, so the President Obama has an iPad that he uses to read his presidential daily briefing every day. We don't want China to have access to that iPad. So are we going to say China gets access to iPhones sold in China, the U.S. gets access to iPhones sold in the U.S., the Syrians get access to iPhones sold in Syria? I mean, do we do it that way? You know, I think that collapses pretty fast, and then the companies are going to be forced to deliver things to governments that we really don't think should have access. And so, you know, we have no evidence that suggests that Apple has actually delivered on what the Chinese want. Certainly, I think the Chinese want that, and if Apple gives it to the FBI, they're going to have to give it to China. Any more questions? Come on, I know that there are a bunch of smart students at this university. Okay. Hang on, and then this gentleman next. Please.
Sorry, force my hand a little bit. So you discussed that we should increase cybersecurity for the means of protecting privacy. Now, the speaker this morning said that the downside of that would be that some sort of terrorist attack happened, they didn't see it, and it would force the hand way too far in the other direction in terms of limiting privacy. How do you see a solution to mitigate that fear and that possibility from happening?
So, preventing terrorist attacks is really hard, and encryption is probably not going to be the thing that makes that impossible. I mean, so for example, with the Paris attacks, you know, the Belgians knew who the bad guys were. They hadn't shared that information with the French. You know, the NSA was listening to and had been keeping an eye on some of the guys who were planning the 9/11 attacks. They hadn't transcribed the intercepted calls. I think everything we've seen up until this point suggests that the biggest problem for the government is often just connecting the dots with the information they already have. You know, is encryption gonna mean that there are gonna be some calls that they're not gonna be able to access? Probably. On the other hand, you know, the NSA isn't just an agency that listens to calls. They're also probably the biggest group of hackers in the world. And they're almost certainly hacking the phones of high-value targets, and encryption doesn't prevent malware. And so if the government can break into your phone, they can turn on the microphone, they can turn on the camera, they can steal information from the device. Encryption basically makes surveillance of bulk communications, so surveillance of everyone's calls or everyone's text, very difficult. But the NSA still has the ability to hack anyone they really want. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, sir.
And I think there was one over here. And then the professor there afterwards.
So with the attacks going on around the world and saying how, you know, piggybacking off him, what about the nation's power?
Can you raise your mic?
About the nation's power grid, how I've heard much talk over the years about how there's a lack of security and how we're at a huge risk for cyber terrorism. Are there any preventive measures to prevent that from happening, such as more encryption, or are there different plans enacted to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so I think you raise a good point, which is, I think there's sort of widespread acknowledgement that the government isn't really that good at defensive cybersecurity. we're really good at hacking other people, and we're really good at spying on other people, and we're not so great at protecting ourselves. And I think in part that's because it's really difficult to do both good offense and defense. And there's certainly an advantage for those who do offense, and I think as a country we've been prioritizing offense for a long time. The defensive side of things just isn't very sexy. It's tougher to get, a great job after you've done defense for a while. I think, for many people in the government, for years they just assumed that the power grid was going to be fine because it wasn't going to be connected to the internet, and then we've realized that everything's being connected to the internet because, the engineer wants to go on vacation and wants to be able to make sure that they can, log in and make sure everything's fine when they're traveling. Whether it's connecting the power grid management computers to the internet or connecting the computers that control jail cell locks to the internet, we've learned a lot of things are connected to the internet that shouldn't be. I think it's really about where you invest resources, and we have to invest in defense. And in part, that means securing ourselves from all threats. Thank you. The professor here with her hand up. It's off.
We often hear the director of the FBI and General Alexander talk about this debate in terms of privacy versus security. But the presentation that you gave today was primarily focused on security risks. Terms matter, and I worry that when we choose the wrong terms, when we talk about privacy versus security, as opposed to competing visions of security, that we're not really grappling with the biggest problems and the ethical issues involved in privileging or prioritizing certain forms of security over another. And we'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it may sound weird for someone who works for a civil liberties group to not talk about civil liberties in my presentation, right? I talked about cybersecurity. And it was a little bit counterintuitive when I first started at the ACLU 3 years ago. And I came in, I said, we need to be focusing on cybersecurity. And my colleagues said, why? Why are we not focusing on privacy, on whether the government should have access, whether they should be intruding in these private spaces? And the fact is that if your data is insecure and it's stolen by a criminal and put online, you have legitimate privacy interests that have now been harmed. Right? Imagine if you have sensitive photographs that are on your phone, and they're stolen and they're published online, and then the #1 Google result for your name is one of those compromising photographs. I mean, those incidents can ruin lives. And for some of these celebrities, they've been able to bounce back, but there are many people who will be haunted by those photographs for the rest of their lives, and it's not fair to have your life ruined because some company messed up their security. Apple's hasn't really been held accountable for that. Everyone sort of pointed fingers at everyone else. I really feel like as a country, we should be focusing more on securing our communications and securing our data. And I think in part that means that this debate needs to shift, as you suggested, to a debate around cybersecurity versus law enforcement, as opposed to privacy versus law enforcement. But I also think that universities like this one should be teaching their students prudent cybersecurity, which means putting a sticker over your webcam so that someone cannot break in and turn on the webcam without your knowledge or consent. That is by far, in terms of bang for buck, the thing that you can do that will protect you the most with the least effort. I actually prefer Band-Aids over stickers because then you can remove it whenever you want and it doesn't leave glue behind on the lens. But we should be moving to a point where universities are teaching their students how to make secure telephone calls. The university should be teaching their students how to send encrypted text messages so that they cannot be easily surveilled by an inquisitive computer science junior. And the fact is the tools are there and probably built into your phone, but we just need to teach people to use them. All right, I think that was all the time I had. Thank you again for your attention and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Well, I think our speaker has done a great, don't go away here. sir.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think he's done a great job of counterpoint, and first informing us of how the encryption debate evolved. A very good dissertation on that, and making a very strong case for encryption as both a privacy and a security element. So I think we'll have to sort it out, but on behalf of the superintendent, staff and faculty, and the Corps Cadets, I'd like to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Masterful. And let's give him another round of applause.